And the thing that's important, the Berkeley pit has changed. We would never be able to go back to the pit again and collect those same microbes. We were surprised to find about 2 years ago, the pit's pH has increased to 4.5, which is prodigious. It can no longer be considered an extreme environment anymore. And so the pit has moved on, but fortunately, the fungi live on not only in our hearts, but also in our lab.
So do you share those out with other researchers, or are you the only ones doing this research?
We're the only ones who have been given permission to do the research. Access to the Berkeley pit is actually highly controlled by Montana Resources. And over the years, I think after we started finding things, Montana Resources became a little more proprietary about people having access to the pit. I think they were also worried about what people might find that was deleterious. They're very sensitive about people calling the pit toxic. And, I think some people were concerned when we found fungi in it, which I actually think is a good sign. If it were more toxic, you wouldn't find anything living in it.
Thank you. It's fascinating.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
My goal has always been to create a really beautiful, comprehensive website that sort of highlights the work that Dawn and I have done. And I can't emphasize enough, Dawn is the most amazing. And I'm kind of the biologist, and Dawn gets to do a lot more of the structure work. He's brilliant. So this is a dual function. But I say I've had the goal of creating that website. The best I can do right now is if you go to the University of Montana's website, we actually are under biomedical sciences. So there is some presence in some of our papers. But Ken mentioned that we've gotten some popular press. We've been in the New York Times, Wired Magazine, Radio Lab, and our biggest claim to fame is we were actually on The Daily Show. Any of you who are familiar with Jon Stewart, when he was on it, The Daily Show, I can't tell you how much our students adored the fact that their faculty were on The Daily Show. So you've arrived when Jon Stewart's production manager knocks on your door and says, I'd like to do a story that includes your work. But unfortunately, we don't have a huge web presence, but I'm working on it. You'd think with COVID going on, the least I could do is come up with the time to do a web presence.
Sandy?
Sandy, you're muted.
You're muted, Sandy.
There you go.
I wanted to know the temperature range of the pit when you were working in it.
That's a great question. The pit actually, you might get a layer of ice on the top, but it doesn't freeze. It's probably primarily about 4 degrees centigrade. So it's, a fairly moderate body. And so when we are growing our organisms, when I mention cryptic biosynthesis, that things are sometimes produced under different conditions that you just wouldn't expect to be there because they weren't there under the conditions you grew. The reality of this type of work, I could take a single fungus, just one, and grow it under 500 different growth conditions at different temperatures, spin rates, not spun, so still culture, grow it for a week, grow it for 5 weeks, and the chemistry will change dramatically. And so you sort of pick a regimen that you focus on and see what you get with that. And it's primarily just Dawn and I in the lab now. With coronavirus, we had to let our 2 undergraduates not come to the lab for a while. but it really is primarily the two of us. So unfortunately, we don't have the time to explore all these different, environmental factors, but we try to stay just with what we would call room temperature. We grow at about 25 degrees centigrade because we don't have an incubator that would allow us to control the growth and cool it down. Those are actually hard to come by.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Ken?
Yeah, I just want to say, Andrea, it's such an inspiring story for a layperson. And I realize how science works when I hear you talk about it, right? So you got curiosity, you got creativity, you've got collaboration. It's truly inspiring. I want to go back to your eureka moment number one. For a layperson, was it just like an epiphany? Suddenly you had this flash of insight? Was that something that emerged gradually over time? How does that moment of discovery happen?
Well, I'm a kind of a genius, so I just thought, I know, let's go to no, actually, it wasn't at all. It was Don and I had been working on Taxol, and our collaborator double-crossed us and took all of our funding. So we were desperate. We literally, in 1991, we found ourselves without any funding, I'm sorry, this was 1995, with students we had to pay. And we thought, what are we going to do? We have no money to do a new um, search site. And a collaborator walked into our lab with a piece of wood that he had found submerged in the Berkeley pit. This was a wonderful chemist we just loved. Um, and this piece of wood was covered with a green slime. And he said, this was in the Berkeley pit. Could this be living tissue? And with the help of collaborator Grant Mittman, who's a phycologist, we identified it as a euglena, a green alga. And it was like, holy crap, there's stuff growing in the Berkeley pit. So we thought, well, we can get a cup of pit water and see what's in it. If euglena can grow, then fungi and bacteria can grow. And it was as we were working on it and thinking, why are we getting these amazing molecules? You start thinking about kind of the nature of environment and the types of organisms that we're getting out of the pit are producing compounds that are very anti-inflammatory. And we don't see that when we work with a lot of, say, Native American medicinal plants. We get a lot more antibiotic compounds. And so we started thinking about, why aren't we getting antibiotics, but we're getting anti-inflammatories? And that's when we really started looking at the kind of the nature of disease and environment and what they have in common. So yeah, it was just sort of a gradual, I'm going to give a talk on this stuff. How do I possibly explain why we're looking in toxic waste? And what's been really exciting, a couple of books have come out now that we've gotten to author the chapters on toxic waste. And we have inspired a whole population of young scientists in China, Russia, India, parts of the United States, down in some of the tin mines and coal mines, to try to do some of the same things. Just like when we looked at Berkeley pit compounds from the yew tree, looking at fungi. Now scientists from around the world have started looking in the bark of their yew trees, and they're finding fungi that also produce Taxol. So it's
The question is the origin of the organism. Is it mantle-based or airborne?
the organisms in the Berkeley pit.
Yes.
Well, they're aquatic because we're doing water sampling. And so some of these organisms are growing dynamically in pit water. Some of them are just suspended spores. And so these probably, the Berkeley pit is complex. And one of the stories I didn't talk about is one of our favorites. In the fall of '95, 342 snow geese flew into the Berkeley pit and died in a snowstorm. And those geese deposited a yeast in the pit, we think, because when we isolated that yeast, it's a black yeast, it had only been found in one other place, and that was a Japanese scientist was doing rectal sampling in geese, and this same yeast was discovered. It's called Fecacomyces exophiala, and in our hands, that yeast sucks metals out of the Berkeley pit. It's absolutely amazing. And that yeast survived in the pit for about 2 years, and then you couldn't find it again, but it lives in our lab. And so whether they blew in, from surrounding soil, whether they're getting pumped in, the Berkeley pit is just part of a very complex mining system. They figure there's something like 2,500 miles of shafts and drifts, and some of those actually, the water feeds into the pit. So a lot of the water is coming in from the underground mining. And so there's carbon source in that water. There's dead birds in that water. So it's probably some of these organisms, if you actually look at the genus and species, they are the same penicillium that's growing on your bread. But if you take the organism that has spent multiple generations in the pit and multiple generations growing on bread, their chemistry is completely different. So it's complicated. Does that answer
Thank
your
you.
question?
Yep. Thank you.
Wolf? If you're saying something, we can't hear you.
How's that?
That's better.
All right. Andrea, I'm not familiar at all with commercialization, patent protection, et cetera, et cetera. You made one comment about Bristol Myers actually probably destroying a result of your work. How does that work? Let's say you discover a cure for cancer out of the pit mine. Is it Montana Resources that benefits, University of Montana? How does that work?
It's interesting you mentioned the Montana Resources thing, because they gave us permission to collect, and the Bureau of Mines are the ones that gave us the water. And back when we first were doing that, MR had no proprietary interest. They have never approached us. They've never asked us to sign anything. So I don't think they would have any ownership. But because we work with the University of Montana and previously Montana Tech, the university actually does all of the patenting and proprietary ownership. And we're actually lucky in Montana, they're fairly generous. So let's say one of these antibiotics actually is successful. Let's say it's makes $1 billion. We have a 50% sharing with the university. And colleagues at other universities say their universities share nothing. So university system is very generous in that. They also have first right of refusal. So we actually, with the antibiotic, we've got both US patents, and now we've gone with international patents. And the university is paying for that because of course they have ownership. So it's a very nice approach. Unfortunately, we were still at Montana Tech with all of the Taxol work, and much as we enjoyed being there, they didn't have people who understood drug discovery or the importance of protecting it. So there were no lawyers helping us, and so it wasn't a very strong situation from the university's perspective. So they kind of gave away the farm. And it's too bad because I think that fungus, if it had been used as an auxiliary source of Taxol, our hope was it would lower the price of the drug because it would have been a really good source of a very complex molecule. But unfortunately, without that kind of patent protection, you're just not going to get anywhere.
So there's really no central clearinghouse for the various branches of the university that works on patent protection, etc. Every school does it their own way.
That, as far as I know, that's what I've seen.
Okay.
And when I was actually got my doctorate at Montana State University. And my very first project was on a fungus that produces a compound that doesn't kill knapweed, but it compromises spotted knapweed. And at the time, Montana State University had a phenomenal resource for patent protection and invention. And I think it's even gotten stronger. So from my perspective, which of course is quite limited, I think Montana State University is more prepared to deal with those sorts of discoveries. Montana Tech is probably great when it comes to mining related technologies, but when it came to drug discovery, it just, we were just sort of this quirky oddity that was working at a school of mines. Why are they doing drug discovery here? Um, and at the University of Montana, I don't know if there's really the financial resources to have a strong legal team. So we've been pretty impressed with what they've been able to do here with fairly limited resources. But now with Inimune Corporation, this small company that formed out of Rocky Mountain Labs, um, these guys are phenomenal. And they actually formed a new center. So this is under Jay Evans. It's called the Center for Translational Medicine. And Jay is helping to really spearhead um, a push towards educating all of us in how to be more aware of how these things work. And, scientists, Don and I are in our 60s. We grew up with the idea, hey, we have a discovery. Let's publish it. Let's share it. Let's go to a meeting and talk about it. And now everything is so hush hush. And it's hard to operate in that kind of an environment. But if you really want a discovery to go someplace to actually have a chance of someday having a novel antibiotic, unfortunately, you have to operate that way, or no pharmaceutical company will touch you. If you're not patent protected, you don't exist. So it's an interesting learning curve. That's the part of science I don't like.
Monty?
Being an ex-educator for 55 years, I was wondering if you are somehow or would be in the future connected with the National Science Foundation and taking your ideas to the classrooms of high schools and getting them involved in some way with what you're doing to inspire more students to get into medicine.
We've never been involved much with the National Science Foundation.
Or some other, yeah.
Because National Science Foundation, by mandate, is not interested in drug discovery. But we have worked, but it's primarily local. Don and I have always worked with undergraduates. We've always been very active in science fair. And now in Missoula, we're very active with the Montana Natural History Center, working in the schools with kids.
Oh, good.
But we were also involved in Spectrum when it had more of a presence here on campus. But we're both educators at heart. I mean, we love teaching. And since moving to that has not been a big part of what we do, and we miss it. And we'd love to get back into more teaching. And I think inspiring young people it's something that makes my day. So
Right.
we'd like to do more of it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Richard? You have to unmute yourself.
Hello, Andrea. Good to see you.
Hello, Dick. Good to see you.
And comment first is it must be at least 20 years ago. I sat in on a seminar when you described your early work here, and it was really interesting and intriguing, but I didn't really think it was go where it has gone. And so congratulations. That's quite a piece of work.
Thank you. Thank you.
You said the pH of the pit has changed by 2 units.
That's correct.
Any idea why that happened?
Oh my God, when we visit it every summer with a group of students in Andre Holian's lab. And every year we go there and tell them, you know, it's the color of a copper penny. It's because of all the rust in it primarily. It's got a pH of 2.5. And 2 summers ago we went, and this orange pit was now cerulean blue. Actually, it looked like a tropical lake, and we were flabbergasted. So we called several of our chemist friends who work on the pit, and they said they were as surprised as we were. And because the pit, you know, there's an angle of repose for most lakes, and the pit, because it's unnatural, its angle of repose defies gravity. And so it has a lot of sloughing events. And they had a couple of major sloughing events that resulted in effective tsunamis that took out the boat dock. And if people had been on the pit, they would have been killed. And so they stopped doing surface sampling a couple of years before that. And so they were not seeing this change in pH and chemistry. So when they started seeing this color change, which I guess was fairly dramatic, now they're starting to do drone sampling. And this is where they're starting to see this dramatic increase. And so 2 of our friends, Chris Gammons, who's a wonderful geochemist, is sort of the lead on this. And a couple of his colleagues, I think it's Gary Iacopini, also at Montana Tech, and the Bureau of Mines started studying it. And what they're finding is, you know how, well, Dick, you could give a course on this. I can hand wave, but at different pHs, different metal species are going to be more or less soluble. And so as they were gradually adding lime to the pit and the pH was gradually increasing, all of a sudden they sort of hit a critical point where iron started falling out. And so the iron oxidation cycle stopped defining the pit. And so now the level of iron in the pit is, you know, a couple hundred parts per million rather than 1,500 parts per million. And we're talking parts per million, not billion. And so Chris Gammons just wrote a paper on it, which I started reading, and then I thought, yeah, I guess it changed. Had other things I wanted to read more. But if you'd be interested in that, I'd be happy to send it to you because it's pretty interesting chemistry. I still think they're doing a little hand waving myself, but I'm not a geochemist. But it was a shock to everybody that the pit changed. I mean, we're talking 80 billion gallons of water with that kind of pH change. I didn't think it would happen in my lifetime.
Thank you. I'd like to see the paper.
You bet. I'd be happy to send that to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Dick.
Okay, any other questions? If not, first, I'd like to thank Andrea for the time she spent. And also like to thank Ken for introducing her to us, or vice versa. And I will send you Wolf's email so that you can sign up as a member of the senior forum. That would be great.
Oh, I appreciate that. And this was really you folks were a wonderful audience. The questions were proved you stayed awake. And let's face it, to an educator, that's job one, is keeping your audience engaged.
Now, you could tell your husband that he was full of baloney, that you kept us awake all the way through.
Yay! Thank you so
Next
much.
week,
Oh,
Yes,
I'm
sir,
going to
go ahead.
sign off now.
next week, we're going to be hearing from the director of the Missoula County Public Library
Oh,
to know what's going on in their move to the new library building. And I'll be sending out the Zoom invite as usual on Mondays.
great. Thank
Everyone
you
take
all.
care. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.